You know, we talk about the culture. Well, what is the culture? The culture is the very air we breathe. It's the world we live in, everything that is around us. That's the culture, civilization, the people that we go to school with, the people that we go to work with, the TV that we watch, the books that we read. It is the culture. We are immersed in it. And at the same time, as Christians, we are called to be set apart from it. And so part of what we're trying to accomplish here in this series over the next several weeks is to figure out how to do that well. That has been the call of the Christian church from the beginning, is to be separate, to be set apart, but yet at the same time to live in. And we've got to figure out how to do that well. And it's becoming, maybe in some ways, increasingly more difficult. As Robbie was pointing out just a few moments ago, the inspiration for this particular class comes from Peter's first epistle, in which he's writing to churches from the city of Rome, and he tells them to be always ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within them. And that word for defense that he uses there is that word apologia. It is the word where we get apology from. But unlike the apologies we're normally used to thinking about, it's not being sorry or feeling bad for our faith and why we believe the way that we believe, but it's giving a defense for it, helping it to be understandable to other people. And before we can make it understandable to others, we have to understand it ourselves. And so we're not here in this class trying to be navel-gazers at church, you know, and trying to just understand how we're different. But we're trying to be here today in this class and over the next several weeks, really intentional about understanding the faith that we believe so that we can explain it to others, and we can live in the culture that we are immersed in. So, as Robbie said, we live in an increasingly hostile place. If we ever were, and there's arguments that we can make that the United States of America was at one point a Christian nation. But if we ever were, it's doubtful if that is still the case. I think it's all pretty obvious to everybody when you turn on your TV screen, when you look around you in the culture, when you hear what your children are being taught in school, and all of those places, it's pretty obvious that we live at best in some kind of post-Christian culture that carries along with it a lot of the kind of accompaniments of Christianity, a lot of maybe some of the general principles of Christianity, but with absolutely none of the foundation. And as that foundation erodes away, increasingly we begin to see problems. And as those problems increase, and as the tensions between the kind of the general principles that we've kind of grown used to and comfortable in our nation kind of erode away as the foundation falls down around it, we can expect to live in a world that is increasingly more hostile to the Christian worldview. And so part of what we're doing in this study is trying to figure out how do we respond? How do we live in that world that is growing increasingly more hostile to what we believe? And so he's doing that, as you notice, if you have your handout, and if you don't have the handout, I apologize, I printed off 30 of them. I think there were 26 people signed up for the class, and it is a great problem to have if we do not have enough handouts. I'm glad there are more of you here than expected. But if there's opportunity to share with somebody next to you, please do that. But if you'll notice that on the first page of that handout, as you look at it, we've kind of put a little summary of the topics we're going to be discussing over the next several weeks. We're going to be looking today at origins, and I'll talk about in a minute why that's important. We are going to be looking at the next couple weeks at issues like individualism, the rise of individualism in society, deconstruction, why people in our culture today are kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, why they are tearing down those traditions and systems and beliefs that maybe they learned when they were growing up. We're going to talk about love is love, sexuality, transgenderism, what is biblical manhood and womanhood. We're going to talk about race and abortion. We're going to talk about politics. Pretty much everything you see when you turn on the news channel at night at home or pull up YouTube, right? All those hot button issues that are hot in the culture. And why are we going to do that? Well, the reason why we're going to do that is because you live in a world that is full of voices, full of people trying to grab your attention, full of noise, okay? That's what it is. We live in a sound bite culture. The short news clip that you can view on Twitter, the small segment, hour-long segment that you can get on the nightly news with their 15-minute snippets or less of each big topic that you're supposed to understand, that you're supposed to get to. And what we want to do in this course, the best we are able to do, is help you to tune some of those voices at least down a notch. And listen to the one voice that really matters. The one voice that we get in the Word of God alone. And that is the voice of God. We want you to be biblical about how you view the world. We want you to be biblical in how you view these issues. And so that's why we're going to address them over the next several weeks. And that's our intent in this course. Now, I like origin stories. How many of you guys have seen some good origin stories? Maybe if you are a fan of superhero movies, you've seen some good superhero origin stories. You know, Peter Parker, who is this normal kind of average nerdy kid who loses his uncle and becomes this inspiring superhero that can swing between buildings as Spider-Man. You know, that's an origin story for the Spider-Man universe. Or maybe you think of one of my favorites, Batman, you know, and his leaving the clay with his mother and father who run into this character, and suddenly he's this crime fighter who is obsessed with taking down criminals and bringing justice to Gotham City. You know, we like origin stories. Well, one of my favorite origin stories is in the C.S. Lewis world of Narnia. It's his 6th book in the series, The Magician's Nephew. Okay? Now, some of you guys, if you bought more modern sets, you might get it first, but you got to read 6. Right? That's the correct order. Right? But it's the origin story of that universe, and it's about 2 kids, a young boy named Diggory Kirk, and his friend from right next door, Polly Plummer, who go on this adventure, and Diggory's Uncle Andrew, in one of the events, goes along with them. And in this story, they visit several new worlds. They're kind of transported magically into these other worlds. And as they're escaping from the main villain, the witch who's chasing them, they find themselves in this new world that is completely dark. They find themselves immersed in total darkness. And we find out later that this dark world in which they find themselves in is the land of Narnia before it has been fully created. And as they're standing there in this total darkness, they hear singing. And things start popping into being. The light comes on. And then the ground is kind of formed around them. And then the oceans out there and along the horizon begin to appear. And then trees and then animals start to sprout out of the ground. And they meet a lion who they later come to know as Aslan, the great lion. And that's the one who's singing, calling all of these animals into being. And it's this really fascinating retelling of what the creation, essentially what the creation story is in the book of Genesis. But there's a particular episode that I find really interesting in that story. And it's the way C.S. Lewis describes Uncle Andrew. Uncle Andrew is kind of this villainous character in the story. And Uncle Andrew is seeing the exact same thing that the children are seeing. He's seeing all the same things. But while the children are like overjoyed with excitement at these animals that are coming out, and as they're kind of losing their mind and hearing animals who are called and who are starting to talk in language that's understandable, as the kids are thinking this is thrilling and amazing, Uncle Andrew's kind of slinking over in a corner with a fearful look on his face, kind of just scanning all of that's going on. And as the animals start to draw closer to him because they're curious about this new creature that they haven't seen, this older man, he becomes terrified. And we wonder at the difference between his reaction and the reaction of the children. He's not responding the same way. And C.S. Lewis describes why that is in the book. He gives this account of Uncle Andrew's perspective. He says this: "When the great moment came and the beast spoke, Uncle Andrew missed the whole point, for a rather interesting reason. When the lion had first begun to sing, long ago when it was still quite dark, he had realized that the noise was a song, and he had disliked the song very much. It made him think and feel things he didn't want to think and feel. Then when the sun rose and he saw the singer was a lion, only a lion, as he said to himself, he tried his hardest to make believe that it wasn't singing and never had been singing, only roaring, as any lion might do in a zoo in our own world. Of course, it can't really have been singing, he thought. I must have imagined it. I've been letting my nerves get out of order. Who has ever heard of a lion singing? And the longer and more beautiful the lion sang, the harder Uncle Andrew tried to make himself believe that he could hear nothing but roaring." Now, the trouble about trying to make yourself stupider, this is Lewis talking now, this is the narrator talking, that you really are, is that you very often succeed. Uncle Andrew did. He soon did hear nothing but roaring and Aslan's song. Soon he couldn't have heard anything else, even if he wanted to. You see, what's interesting about that origin story, about this portion of the story, is the description of Uncle Andrew and how he responds to the song. The story he tells himself. Okay? The stories that we are told, the stories that we believe, and the stories that we tell ourselves matter a great deal. They matter a great deal. As you look at your hand out there, you've got some blanks there in that first box. Here's that first set of blanks there. If you can control the narrative, if you can control the story, you can control the meaning. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? Meaning is determined by the story. Meaning is determined by the context. I'm going to say a few phrases here, and let me know if anybody can tell me where this is from. Life is like a box of chocolates. Forrest Gump. All right? You complete me. Look at my wife. All right? Here's another one. We've got no food. We've got no job. Our heads are falling off. Dumb and dumb. All right. And here's one for the kids, maybe. Let it go. All right? Frozen, right? Everybody knows. All right. The reason why you can do that, and as you do that, because those are just random phrases, aren't they? They're just random phrases. They could literally mean anything. But the reason why I say them, and it immediately brings to mind Lloyd and Harry sitting in their apartment, thinking about taking the briefcase to Aspen, right? The reason why you can hear that phrase and immediately know what it means is because you know the story. You know the story. You know the beginning. You know the characters, the rise and the action, all the way to the end. You know the story. And so what I just said, to prevent them from being random words that have no meaning whatsoever, the meaning is just poured into them by the story, the context that's filled in around them. And this world is filled with stories that people are trying to tell you to get their meaning, to understand their meaning. And so in this world, we have to be careful about what stories we believe. What stories are we going to build our life on? What stories are we going to tell ourselves for the rest of our lives that will govern the meaning of our lives? We have to be careful about that. Now, what I'm going to contend with you today is that there are two main stories in this world. There are two main stories in this world. Two competing stories. Two stories that compete for your attention. And they're this. The first story that we see is the story of chaos. And the second story we see is the story of cosmos. Cosmos. And we'll talk about that in a minute here, but before we get there, there are many creation myths in the world, in world history. Okay? And just a few of them. In the ancient world, there was the Babylonian creation story, which was called the Enuma Elish. And in the Enuma Elish, two gods, Aspu and Tiamat, created some lesser gods, and then a great war erupted between these lesser gods. And in that great war, one of these created gods, a god named Marduk, was able to gain the upper hand over those different creator gods and all their creatures, and had himself declared Lord over all the gods. So in the Babylonian regions, the god Marduk was worshipped as supreme above all because of his great feat of subduing all the other gods. Okay? That's one creation myth. In Egypt, in the Book of the Dead, there's a description of Atum, who creates himself out of the darkness and the great waters of the world that pre-existed him. And he creates himself out of these waters, so he is a self-creating God, out of this infinite darkness, and then creates all of the other deities that control various aspects of the world. And of course, we can go on and on. We have the great creation myths of the Greeks, or some of the primitive creation myths of, like, the Aztecs in the Americas, or primitive Indian or Native American religions. Those would be ancient creation myths. Well, there is a modern creation myth as well. There's a modern one, okay? And that modern creation myth that is very popular even in our day is essentially this: that the world and everything in it was created by nothing. Nothing. And out of this great nothingness, this singularity of infinite density that has no real description of any quality whatsoever, everything appears. Or maybe this great vast network of multiverses that is chaotic and involves every conceivable kind of world that could possibly exist. We're just one of these particular universes in this chaos of multiverses. Okay? You see, the modern creation myth is just chaos. Meaninglessness. We're nothing. We came from nothing. We're going to nothing. This world has no inherent meaning or purpose at all to it. It all just came from nothing. Randomness. That's the modern creation myth. And in that, us humans have just evolved from some primordial soup, from some single-celled creature that just happened by chance to come about and be developed out of non-life. Suddenly, in some fantastical, magical act, life came from non-life, and here we are, grown-up germs, stardust, a million years, a billion years removed. And that story, that creation myth, is taught to your kids at school. It's coming to a Marvel movie sometime near you, sometime somewhere near you. And it's everywhere. And it's the one that, quite frankly, ever more increasingly in the world and in this country is the one that is believed. So that's the story. And then there's one more creation myth. And I call it a myth because it is, in a sense, a myth, but it's the true myth. It is the history, it is the real story, the true story, and that's the story of cosmos. That there is something that explains everything else. That this world is not just a bunch of random things, that it's not just a bunch of diverse, different things, but it's actually a universe. We throw that word around a lot. That word was there for a purpose. And the reason why we call the world a universe, and the reason why we go to the university, is because it's a connection of two words, diversity and unity. And the idea there is there's something that connects everything together, that makes sense of it all. And so you're supposed to go to the university, right, to make sense of the world. All right? But that's the idea of cosmos, that the world does make sense. It's not random. It's purposeful. It can be understood. And those are the two stories that compete for your attention in this world. So, as we think about that, I want to turn our attention to Scripture here and think about Romans chapter 1. Most of the time we come to Romans chapter 1, and there are some verses here printed on the first page of your handout. When we think about Romans chapter 1, we think about this great statement of Paul that he makes, where he explains that God is obvious from the world that he's made. So we read this. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. That's how Paul describes it in Romans chapter 1. But here's the problem that we see, is that it's not that just God has shown himself. There's a comment here that's made about man. And the comment that is made about man is that man is in the business, even though this is an obvious reality, man is in the business of suppressing that reality, of hiding it, of denying it. So I want us to do something for a second. Suppose that's true. Suppose for a minute that the Bible is accurate in its assessment of mankind. What would you suppose would happen in the world? Well, you would suppose would happen is that mankind, as they move along through history, would come up with various alternative stories, right, that benefit them, that allow them to deny the true story. You know, they might come up with a story like the Babylonians did, where it's not the God who created everything who ultimately is raised supreme over all, No, 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 no. It's one of the created lesser gods, right? One of the creatures who conquers and wins and is ultimately named to be supreme. Like us. Okay? Well, we might just deny altogether that there is a God who created everything and just say, no, there was really just this primordial nothingness, this waters, and then there was a God who kind of created himself. Like we can do. We can create ourselves in our image and do what we want to do, right? And throughout history, as mankind advances in technology, as mankind advances in knowledge, would you expect them to use that technology and that knowledge, their great tools of science, to come to the truth? Or would you expect them to create even more and more clever mythologies that allow them to deny the truth so that they can live the way that they want? What would you expect? And the reality is, that's exactly what we see. That's exactly what we see. And by the blanks there in that second box, by denying the story and its author, man thinks he has an excuse to live the way he wants to live. You see, because if something else has created this world, and if something else is in control of the narrative, in control of the story, and if something else has created us for its purposes, then we ought to live the way it wants us to live. We ought to do what it wants us to do. But if we can deny that reality, we can live the way we want to live and do what we want to do. And modern science, and when I use that phrase in this course, not because I don't like science, I love science, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But modern science, so-called modern science, is what we'll talk about in kind of quotes there, is used by mankind to tell a myth. And that myth is that there is no need for God. The world just comes into being from a singularity that exploded one Thursday night at 1 o'clock in the morning, 15 billion years ago, or however long it was. So modern science is being used, unfortunately, to create, to tell a new creation myth, a more clever creation myth than the ancient Babylonians could tell, than the ancient Egyptians could tell. Now, I want to distinguish modern science from true science. True science is an incredibly important thing. Christians should be engaged in it. Christians should be excited about it. And it tells us really obvious things, like everything that begins to exist must have a cause, right? Must have an explanation for its existence. If it came into being, really obviously, there must be a reason why it came into being. So if the universe came into being, there must be a reason beyond the universe that it came into being. Whatever that reason is, that's what we're going to talk about, right? Really obvious things. That's what true science tells us. True science tells us things like, gosh, there's a lot of evidences in the world that we see, in our modern observations, using our high-powered microscopes and our telescopes that tell us a lot about how this world must be designed. And if you go and you look out in the world and you do some research on this, you can find a lot of great resources on the fine-tuning of the universe, where we can look at the universe and we can say, hey, there are so many factors in the universe that are specially tuned that if they were just a little bit different, life would be impossible. If our planet was just a few hundred meters in a certain direction, or 1,000 meters this way or that way, or just a little bit colder, our sun was just a little bit hotter, or the gravitational force was just a little bit different, by fractions of a fraction of a fraction, life would be impossible. There's great evidence about, as we get to know more about DNA and how it works inside of our body and how it uses complicated information in the process of building cells and in the process of repairing itself and determining which cells are used in which part of the body, how there is an incredible amount non-random, very specific, function-specific information in each cell that governs how you... It's impossible, it's almost to come to any conclusion that there has to be some design element there, that could just come about by chance. As we look at the various machines that our cells use to build certain functions in it, machines that are more complicated than any machines that any human engineer can come up with, it becomes increasingly impossible to deny that there must have been somebody who designed this, and this just didn't come about by chance. As we look at the origin of life, which still no one can explain, and they're not even close to explaining how to create new life from dead things. At some point, modern science, to the extent it denies the evidence for design in the world that we see, starts to look a lot like Uncle Andrew. They're just not looking. They don't want to see it. They don't like how it makes them think, and they don't like how it makes them feel. So there's a lot of use for science if it's done in the correct way. Now, one of the things that's really a big topic in this issue, and that I want to address, while not getting too bogged down in, is the issue that is the great debate most of us probably grew up with if we grew up in the church, and if we've seen this debate. It's the young earth, old earth debate. Okay? Now, this is a really important discussion, and I don't want to say it's not. It's a really important discussion, and I think it's important that Christians are engaged with it and look into it. And if you like that kind of thing, there are some great resources out there that you can you pick up books by. One of my favorite young earth creationist authors and speakers is a young man by the name of Dr. Jason Lyle. He does an incredible job explaining how science supports a young earth view. And I have to say, I'm very sympathetic to that view. Not always sure I agree with it, but I'm very sympathetic to it, and I enjoy hearing presentations that are well done about it. If you want to look more into the old earth view, there are great scientists like Hugh Ross who talk about how the scientific evidence from an old earth perspective is very consistent with biblical teaching, or John Lennox, or Stephen Meyer. There are great presentations out there, and I think we should engage in that. Now, the main issues, these are your blanks here for this box, the real question about young earth and old earth are this: can we defend a literal reading of Genesis 1 in the age of modern science? Okay. Can we defend reading Genesis 1 as real six-day creation in the age of modern science, where so much of the consensus appears to be that we live in an old earth? And from an old earth perspective, the question is, can we make Genesis 1 consistent with modern science? Can we read this text in a way that's consistent with the way we appear to see the world from a scientific point of view? And again, I think that's a great question, but here is what I want to say about that today. We're not going to decide that here in this class. We're not going to decide that here in this class. And so I want to address it while also kind of skimming over the surface on that a little bit. And here's what I want to say about this. I think that since we're not going to resolve that issue here, we kind of have to live in such a way and work in such a way that we can think through these issues of origins while not being obsessed with having to resolve that issue. And I think that it's possible to do that. I think it's really possible to do that. So what I'm going to talk about today for a little bit is the liturgical view of how we should view the creation account in Scripture. The liturgical view, okay? And here's what I want to do. Sometimes, when we come to Genesis 1, and we come with our modern set of glasses on, and we begin to think, okay, the questions that the culture is asking around Genesis 1 is the scientific questions. Scientific question. Is this how God created the world? In 6 literal days. Is that how he did it? Did he create things in this order? Okay. Now again, that's an important question. I think Genesis 1 may have something to say about that. But what I want to point out here is that those scientific questions that we tend to ask today are more driven by what I'm calling modern science than they are by maybe the real question the Bible is trying to answer. Okay. What I mean by that is when you think of the modern science and the questions that we ask ourselves in the modern science, at best, we're probably talking about the questions that people had about the world for the last 500 years. At most. At most. That's when kind of the scientific revolution could maybe arguably be said to have taken place, that started thinking about the world and looking at rock formations and looking at the stars and wondering about the speed of light and how fast it would take light to get from, some galaxy 13 light years away to here, whatever the case might be. Before that, people would not have been concerned about those questions. That wouldn't have been the first thing on their mind. Okay? And so for over 3,500, 4,000, 5,000 years of history, people wouldn't have obsessed about those questions. Is it really fair to say Genesis 1 is trying to answer our scientific questions? And so while I don't want to say it has nothing to say about that, I do want to ask the question, is that the main point? Okay? And what I think the main point is, and what's probably fair to say, is that the main point of Genesis is liturgical. Okay, it's liturgical. And when I say that, when you come to church on Sunday morning and you kind of, especially if you come to C3, you kind of know our liturgy, right? Start off with a song in the morning, stand up, sing, have announcements, 2 more songs, sit, have communion, sit down again, hear the sermon, stand up, sing another. That's our liturgy, right? That's how we worship at C3, right? You kind of know that liturgy. We have a cadence, a rhythm to the way we worship, the way we do things. And I think what's going on in Genesis, I think if we looked at the context of it, we find that that's probably more of what's going on there, okay? And liturgy is the form in which worship is conducted. It's the form in which worship is conducted. Now, to kind of help you think through this, I want to try to help you understand the context in which Genesis, as well as the entire first 5 books of the Bible, would have been written. Okay? So let's think about that for a minute. In Joshua chapter 24 here, which is, of course, the first book after the Pentateuch. It is Joshua is, of course, the successor to Moses. And Joshua is the one that leads the Jewish people, Israel, into the Promised Land. And they conquer the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership. And in chapter 24, the last chapter of Joshua gathers the entire nation who has just entered the Promised Land and conquered the land. He leads them to the city of Shechem. And there in the city of Shechem, they renew their vow to serve God. Okay? They renew their vows. And as they're there renewing their vows, Joshua says this to the people in verse 14. He says, "Now, therefore, fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods of your fathers, served beyond the river Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." Okay? That's his call to the people of Israel. Put away all other gods. You see what God has done for you. He has fulfilled every promise he's made to you. You've seen it. You've seen him lead you out of Egypt. You've seen him bring you through the wilderness. You've seen him give you the land he told you he would give to you. Put away, fully and finally, all those other gods that you served in Egypt and all of those gods that your fathers served in Babylon. And he's doing this at Shechem for a reason. It was at Shechem that it was at Ur, remember in Ur, when Abraham was there in the city of Ur, which was Babylon, and God called him out of the city of Ur and said, "Go to Shechem." That's where Abraham went. And then when his grandson went back to his people in Babylon and found himself a wife, 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and then as they were leaving to go back to be closer to Isaac, his father, and Esau, as they get close, he buries the idols of the family gods that he had started to worship back in Babylon. He buries them at the tree of Shechem. And here Joshua is saying, put away those gods. The gods of the Babylonians, the gods of Egypt, and worship the God who has brought you out of Egypt. Worship the God who has brought you into the land that you now inhabit. And that's important context because everything that has happened, everything that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and Joshua is his successor, and what Moses and Joshua have been trying to do this whole time is say, you served other gods in these other places. This is the God that's faithful to you. This is the God that you should serve. Put away those gods and serve this God. And the reason why that's important is because Israel was set free from Egypt to worship God. That's that blank there in that box. And they were to leave behind their pagan religions forever as a result. And so what we should look at when we look at the first 5 books of the Bible is that Moses and Joshua are giving, or Moses specifically, is writing an origin story to help them understand how their God is different from the gods that they are leaving behind. Okay? So to understand Genesis 1 a little bit more clearly, I think here's some of the things we need to think about. The first thing that we see when we come to Genesis 1 is this. God is the sovereign creator of all things. Remember when we talked about the Babylonian creation story? Okay. That it was these 2 deities who pre-existed everything. Okay. And they create kind of out of the primordial waters, I think is what it's called. And they create out of that all these lesser gods. And then that one God who who's declared sovereign over all of them is just this creature who is strong enough and powerful enough to conquer all the other gods. Or in Egypt, Atun is this self-created God who didn't exist forever and who creates himself out of the nothing. And when we read in Genesis 1, as we look at those chapters, the first thing that we read in Genesis 1, verse 1, is in the beginning, God. There's no primordial nothingness. There's no account of his self-creation. He's not some lesser deity, some lesser part, but in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is the same as to say he created everything. Everything. And so that's where Moses starts. And then Moses, to address what the Israelites were used to in these other lands, amongst the gods that they worshipped, who controlled various aspects of the cosmos. Maybe it's the waters, there was a god of the water, maybe there was a god of agriculture and of livestock, maybe there was a god of the sky and a god of the sun. What Moses does is he's writing this creation account, as he describes in the 6 days of creation, he describes how the God that the Israelites worship creates everything. Creates everything. Himself. Not relying on any other lesser deities to do the work. So on day 1, he creates light and darkness. He creates the light, and the darkness is the absence of light, and he separates those 2 out so that we can distinguish them. And then in day 2, he creates the sea and the sky. And then in the day 3, he creates the land and the plants. And then in day 4, the sun, moon, and stars, which are the things that we see that actually govern how we observe and see the lights, okay, and the darkness. Then he creates the fish and the birds, which are the things that actually populate the land, or the sea and the sky. And then on the last day, he creates animals and men who populate the land, right? And so the thing we need to walk away from in understanding Genesis 1, probably the fundamental thing, if we don't walk away with anything else, is that the God that's described in Genesis chapter 1 is a sovereign creator of all things. And that's the blank there. He's the sovereign creator of all things. And he reveals himself, if you remember, he reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush as I am. He doesn't say, I'm the one who began a long time ago, or the one that came into being or brought myself into being. He describes himself as the I am. I have always been here. I have always existed. I'm eternal. And in doing that, he distinguishes himself from all the other deities. And the second thing that we see in the creation account is this. God gives mankind a purpose. He tells him what part they are to play in his creation. And we read that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, when he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And so we see that in this world that God creates mankind as image bearers. And I want you to think about that for a minute in the context of the second commandment. Remember the second commandment? One of the things that marked Israel as different from all the other nations and the gods that they worshiped is all those other nations took mud from the ground or took wood from the forest and carved for themselves gods that they worshiped. They made idols. And God specifically tells his people, you shall not make idols. I don't need these fake images to be worshipped. But he does tell his people, that's your job. You're to be my image bearer. People are to see my power, my glory, through you. That's your purpose. And so I'm creating you male and female to do a job. And he gives them a task. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we read in Genesis 1:30 this statement. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Okay? What Moses is sure to include in his creation account is the definitive statement that everything that God had made is good. It's good. And I think we see in that statement right there, is the basis for what is most fundamental and what is most important to our Christian walk with Christ, and that's faith. You see, right here in Genesis 1, what Moses is telling the people of Israel to do is to say, believe, in spite of the fact that sometimes this world looks really bad, that what God has created is good. Have faith that what God has created is good. Believe that. That's part of the story. That's the end of the story that you're supposed to understand. And then on the seventh day, he tells them, and there will be rest. There might be work to do now, there might be difficulty to do now, but there is a day of rest that our God rests from his creation. Okay? That's the story. It's like having an executive summary to the entirety of what God has done. Right? He's sovereign over all. He's given us a purpose. It's good. The world is a good world. Have faith. Trust God. And one day there will be rest. And in God's sovereignty, over 3,000 years after, 1,500 years after this was written, we meet the person of Christ. And in Christ, who we place our faith, in Christ, we see the true image bearer. Right? You see, in the next chapter, in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, we begin to see it all fall apart in many ways. We begin to see the story go what appears to be bad. But as we read more into Scripture, and as we see it unfold, we see what God has spoken over man, that we are to take dominion over the world. that mankind is to be the image bearer of God come true in a real person, in history, in the person of Christ. And when we see that, and we see that all authority and power has been given to him, that all dominion has been given to him, we see that what God spoke ages ago when he created the world actually comes to pass. And that's the story. So what are we to make of that in kind of conclusion? We'll go over these really quickly, and then we can talk about application here in a little bit. But here's the thing I want you to think through as you think through Genesis 1 and this origin story. Okay? First, it is an origin story. Genesis 1 is our origin story. It explains, it provides an understanding of where we come from and what our purpose is and who got us here. How did we get here? Okay. Number 2, Genesis 1 is a statement of faith. When it tells us that what the world that God created is good, we are to believe that by faith. That's fundamental. In a certain way, there's a proto-evangel right there in Genesis 1, where God declares it is good. And we're to take that by faith. Number 3, it defines what this world means. It gives us our beginning. It gives us an end, that one day God will be vindicated and there will be a day of rest that we can enter into. And we can look at the New Testament for further statements on that. And it gives us our role in this world. It explains what our role is. Number 4, it gives us understanding and wisdom. Okay. It gives us understanding and wisdom. What I mean by that is, in order to really have any understanding in this world, we can know a lot of things, right? We can know a lot of things. But in order to really understand this world, you have to be able to know how those things fit together. How do they relate to one another? And you can't do that, as I kind of described earlier, without the story. They're not just a bunch of random, disconnected facts. They all fit together somehow. And we can understand how they all fit together. At least we can begin to understand how they all fit together if we know the story. If we know that there is a story. And because we can understand, we can act wisely. Wisdom is impossible unless you understand how the world works. If you don't understand how the world works, you're just guessing. And to guess is foolish. It's the opposite of wisdom. What we also need to understand is that our inclination, the inclination of the culture around us, is to suppress the story. And the reason why the culture is bound to do that, and we need to understand that as we go out there and as we engage in the world, that the world is bound to suppress it. And the reason why they want to, and this is point 6, is because we want to bear our own image. We want to bear our own image. We want to be our own person. We want to do what we want to do. And so as a result of that, number 7, because of that, we are in search of a mythology to give us an excuse to do what we want to do. And number 8, our current culture is a result of that mythology. Current culture. And so as we think about the topics we're going to cover over the next several weeks, I want you to think about it from that point of view. That there is a mythology out there of chaos. And that impacts the way people think about the world and their role in it. So here's some application things. First, and I think this is really important, we have nothing to fear from true science. True science is our friend. True science reveals the glory of God. We should be encouraging people to go into the sciences. We should be encouraging people to explore the world. We should have no fear of our kids learning things about the world and engaging with science as long as it's done with the true story in mind, right? The number 2 is we can fully trust Scripture. That however this young earth or old earth debate turns out, we can understand that what Scripture is essentially teaching, what we know Moses was trying to do, he was trying to impress upon the Israelites the sovereignty of their God, their role in the world, and the goodness of the world that God had created. We can trust that. It's just as applicable today to us as it was to them. And it's been, those three principles right there have been applicable in every single age. We can fully trust the Scriptures. The third thing we have to do here as we apply some of these things is we have to test every narrative that we hear, every narrative that we see, and every narrative that we read against the true story. You have to test it. Is it consistent with the true story? And finally, here, we can examine and understand the issues in our culture through the lens of God's story. So the topics that we're discussing of individualism, our role in the world, our purpose and our meaning, okay? All of those are addressed by the true story. All of those are governed by whether you believe the true story or the false mythology of the world that there is no ultimate purpose. There is no ultimate meaning. You have to make it up. So as we think about issues like identity and sexuality, as we think about transgenderism, just to pick an example, if I truly believe that there is no inherent meaning in this world, why can't I make it up? But if there is a story, if we were created in God's image, that changes things. Finally, we can have understanding and wisdom. We can understand why things are the way that they are, why people are believing the stories that they're believing, and how we can act wisely in the world if we understand the true story. And then finally here, this is our task. This is our task. When we engage with the world, our job is to tell the true story. Is to tell the true story. Not just Genesis, just one, but the whole counsel of God. As He's explained how exactly, through Christ, He has made this world good. Okay?